This is a 2007 Porsche 911 Targa 4S, and it's probably the weirdest and quirkiest version of the 997 Porsche 911, which was made in the late 2000s. It may not look particularly weird or quirky from your angle, but it is, because it has a massive glass sunroof, and because almost nobody bought it. In fact, a lot of enthusiasts don't even know that Porsche made a Targa version of the 997, but they did. And today I'm going to review this one and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this 997 Targa 4S is currently for sale, and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This Targa is a one-owner car that was bought new by the owner 17 years ago. It has a 6-speed manual transmission, no modifications, relatively low mileage, and it's the tremendously rare Targa body style. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this 997 Targa 4S, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the 997 911 Targa. But before I get into the specific quirks of this car, a little background, because the history of the Targa is a long and winding one with some very bizarre and unusual turns. So, the 997 Porsche 911 came out for the 2005 model year, and the Targa version, with its giant glass sunroof that opens up, we'll get there, it came back for 2006. But the history of the 911 Targa starts long before this car, goes all the way back to the 1960s and 1970s, where the Targa began. So, here's the basic deal. Back in that era, there was a lot of talk that the United States government regulators were going to kill the convertible. Basically, the thought was convertibles are unsafe. If you roll over, there's nothing to protect people on the inside, and they will be killed. And frankly, by the standards of the 1960s, that was probably accurate. But convertibles were really popular back then, and so automakers started to think through ways they could create a similar convertible feel while still meeting regulatory challenges like a bar in the vehicle above, so that if it rolls over, it could support its weight and people would not be killed. And thus the Targa was born. Now, the original 911 Targa models came out in this era, and basically they had a removable roof panel, a lift-off panel that you could take away in order to provide the open-air experience of a convertible. But unlike a convertible, it wasn't a full folding roof that went all the way back for a total open air, because directly behind the lift-off panel, you had a bar going across the entire rear of the car, and usually behind that, you had a fixed glass rear window. So in theory, it was sort of convertible-like, but it wasn't a true convertible. Give you the best of both worlds, safety and open-air driving experience. And it wasn't just Porsche who did this. Several other automakers also created Targa versions, or T-tops, or lift-off panel, whatever they called them. A lot of different cars and car companies had similar vehicles in this era. However, what happened next was a bit of a surprise. Specifically, after going back and forth and talking about it for many years, the US government didn't ban convertibles. Despite the conjecture, the hype that they may have to go away, it never actually happened. And so these Targa-topped cars that had come out in the 60s and 70s and 80s gradually started to leave the market once automakers realized that the government was never really going to crack down on convertibles. Ferrari, for example, had Targas throughout the 70s, the 80s, but ditched them by the late 1990s. It was totally gone. And most other automakers followed suit. Very few Targa-topped models carried their way into the 90s and the 2000s. But Porsche kept the Targa top going for all this time and all these years, even though they simultaneously offered a convertible that was much more popular. There were still buyers who wanted the Targa, and so Porsche kept making them. But in the mid-90s, there was a major change from the traditional Targa roof that came before, where you lifted it out and it was cumbersome and then you had to find a place to put it. In the mid-90s, they went to a power-operated giant glass sunroof on the 993 version of the 911, the 993 Targa. That car got the glass sunroof, the huge one, and a new version of the Targa was born. As you can imagine, it wasn't tremendously popular because ultimately you could just get a convertible and it provided an even more open air driving experience. Or if you wanted a coupe, you could get a coupe, but Porsche kept offering it even as sales slowed down. And I have to say, I worked at Porsche when the 997 Targa was on sale. And by the end of this car's production, we were lucky to sell 8 to 10 of them a month. Nationally, the manual transmission Cayenne was more popular than the late production 997 Targa. It just was not a popular vehicle. And as a result, they're tremendously rare. One of the rarest versions of the 997 Porsche 911 and the 996 and the 993 that came before, the Targa models are just tremendously uncommon. And frankly, it's a wonder Porsche even kept offering it at all. But they did. So the real quirk of this car is obviously its glass Targa roof, and most enthusiasts, even hardcore Porsche enthusiasts, don't know how it works and have never seen it operate. So let's go through the process right now. Here in the center console, there is a switch. This switch here rocks forward and backwards, and it operates the Targa top, and it has 2 separate positions. So if you push the switch halfway back, just a half push, then the sunshade that's fixed in place over the front seat area, that retracts backwards, the sunshade goes away, and then you have a full glass canopy above you so that you can enjoy the sun. If you press the Targa rocker switch all the way back, then the glass panel itself starts to retract backwards, and interestingly, it goes under the fixed glass panel in back, and then it creates a full open air driving experience above the front seat compartment. So you still have that same open air experience that you had in previous Targa models in the 70s and 80s, but now it's all done electronically with the push of a switch. Now, interestingly, the sunshade operates independently of the Targa roof. So even when the Targa roof is in its back position, if you, for whatever reason, want the sunshade back there, you can make that happen. Just push the switch in the other direction, a half push, and the sunshade will open itself back up and unfurl and reveal itself as a sunshade. It blocks your rear visibility back there, but you can do it. Or of course, you can close it back up again, so you just have full glass and you don't have to try to look through the sunshade while the glass top is back above the rear seats. Now, the next interesting thing, of course, is when you go to close your Targa roof. And doing that, you press the switch in the center the other direction, give it a full press, and then the Targa roof closes automatically. And you can see it slides back into the same position where it was before, creating a full roof in the car as you would expect. And the Targa top is now closed. And from there, once again, you can operate the sunshade. It's a half push backwards or forwards to have the sunshade go in whichever direction you want. If you want the shade from the sun, you can do that, or if you want it to be fully opened, you have that capability as well. And that's the basic operation of the Targa top. But there's more. Now, the more that there is to the Targa is back here. This is going to really surprise Porsche 997, 911 owners. You have this rear window on the back of the car, like all 997 coupes do. And in the 997 coupe, this rear window is fixed in place, which makes sense because the storage compartment is up front. This is just a rear window, like in a sedan or any other coupe. But in the 997 Targa, things are a little bit different. Take a look at the key and you see you have 2 buttons to open 2 compartments. One is obviously the front trunk. You push that and it opens. But the other one, there's an arrow pointing to the back of the car. That doesn't open the engine compartment for the rear engine. Instead, you push it and it opens up this glass panel back here. You can lift it up and open, and then you have access to a small storage compartment behind the rear seats. Now again, this is not available in any other 997 coupe model. It was only on the Targa, a little added practicality back here. If you wanted a little bit more space, you could have it where you could stick stuff. It turns the 997 into a hatchback. And I think that virtually nobody knows that's the case, but with the Targa, it was. And same deal in the driver's door sill. You have switches to open up the front trunk, the rear engine compartment, and the Targa top hatchback rear glass. Now, interestingly, when you pull the switch to open the rear glass, there is a separate warning message for the rear glass in the gauge cluster screen. It warns you that the Targa flap is opened up. Porsche had to come up with new buttons, new switches, and even a new warning message just for the Targa in order to make all of this work. But they did, and it's actually a pretty nifty thing. This giant sunroof, the sunshade, and extra practicality. And there's one more really cool Targa touch that we have to talk about before we move on, and that would be this silver strip that goes over the windows on the side of the car. On the 997 911 Targa, Porsche only put this silver strip on a Targa. So if you see a 997 coupe and you can't see the sunroof situation, maybe you see it from the side and you're wondering, is that a Targa? Your question will be answered by the silver strip. If the car has the silvered strip, then it is a Targa. If it does not, then it's a coupe. It was a very subtle Porsche enthusiast only way to distinguish between the Targa and a regular 911 coupe from the side, and now you know about it too. Now, after years of fairly mediocre sales figures with the Targa, this being a unique and tremendously uncommon version of the Porsche 911, everybody knows what happened next with the 911 Targa. For the next version of this car, the 991 911, Porsche completely changed how the Targa roof operates. They made it more of a traditional lift-off panel like in years past, and they gave the car a roll bar going over the sides, just like Targas from back in the day. It was sort of a nostalgia play. It gave you more openness to the air because the roof rails didn't stay in place like they did in this Targa, and it radically increased the desirability of the 911 Targa once again. These days, the 911 Targa is among the very most desirable body styles of the newest Porsche 911. There's long waiting lists. People really want to get a Targa. It's seen as really cool again, which is so funny because for so many years there, it languished and Porsche almost got rid of it entirely before revamping it in 2013, 2014 to bring it back in a more exciting way. But this car hails from the earlier days where barely anybody had the Targa, and it's tremendously rare. And next up, we move on to powertrains because the 997's powertrain drivetrain situation was rather unusual. I say that because all 997 Targa models had all-wheel drive. All of them. You couldn't get a two-wheel drive Targa. You only had a Targa 4 base model or a Targa 4S. Now, I'm not entirely sure why they did this, but I suspect their thinking was if you live somewhere that's always sunny with no bad weather, you're just going to get a convertible. The Targa is more for people in colder climates where they might need all-wheel drive, and then they get this quasi-convertible instead, and so they gave them all four-wheel drive. At least that's my thought, but they all did. Now, this Targa is a Targa 4S model. And like I said, you could get a base Targa or a 4S. Now, the base car in 2007 had a 3.6 liter flat six with 320 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque. If you upgraded to the mighty Targa 4S, the engine was enlarged to a 3.8 liter flat six, and power went up to 355 horsepower, and torque jumped to about 295 pound-feet. So the 4S added more power, more torque, and a bigger engine. As for interesting quirks and features of the Targa, beyond just its Targa roof, I've reviewed quite a few 997, 911 models, so I won't get into every single interesting quirk, but I will go through the highlights, starting with the fact that you can see the engine, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but it's impossible in newer 911 models. For the last 15 years or so, you can't actually access the engine in a Porsche 911, but back in the 997 era, you still could. So here it is. And next we move inside the 997 Targa, where one of the first things you notice when you sit down is that the center console is an absolute button fest with all sorts of different buttons and switches to control the infotainment system, the climate control, and various other things. Every time someone tells me that they hate touch screens and they want to go back to physical buttons, I think of this car. This is what it would look like if you went back to physical buttons. It wouldn't be pretty and it wouldn't be easy. It's hard to figure out exactly where your button that you're trying to press is even located because there are so damn many of them since this isn't a touchscreen. And indeed, that's another interesting and novel item in here, the infotainment screen. It is a very old school system, nothing that anyone from today would ever even try to use. The very old feeling navigation system, an old map. It's just kind of funny to see that this was the pinnacle of technology back 17 years ago. But in fact, it was, and this was considered pretty cutting edge at the time, just not today. Now, with that said, on the subject of information and screens in this car, one thing I've always loved about the 997 and other Porsches from this era is this little stalk coming off the steering column controls the readout in the center of the gauge cluster, and it allows you to cycle through and see various different important pieces of car information. Like, for example, the music you're listening to, your tire pressures, your fuel distance till empty, your average fuel economy. You don't have to go into the center screen and figure out where all that stuff is located. You can just scroll through with this little stalk and find it right there in that screen in front of you. It's sort of an auxiliary screen that shows only the most important things, and I think that's a great idea. I love that feature. But back to the center control stack for a second, because there are two buttons on this center stack that are especially important. One is this one here, which turns on the sport exhaust. That is a factory sport exhaust that this car was optioned with back when it was new, and it sounds great. Take a listen. You will notice another button here right next to the sport exhaust. That turns on your sport suspension. You press that and things get a little tighter, a little firmer, but it also improves your handling, makes you go around the corners faster. And of course, directly next to that, you have the button to press to raise or lower the rear spoiler. In a non-turbo 997, the rear spoiler was really just a flap on the top of the engine compartment. It would come up automatically at certain speeds to increase your stability, but if you wanted to raise it up manually yourself, you could do that with the push of a button. Now, the other thing that I always loved in 997s was the very cool trick cup holders that these cars have. It's over on the passenger side of the dashboard. You can see there's this silver strip here. It just looks like a trim panel, but you push on it, it pops down, and then it reveals there are cup holders hidden inside the dashboard right here. Now, to take the cup holders out, you just push on them and the cup holder comes out, pretty standard. But the cool thing is you can then close up this trim panel so that it doesn't show you all the inner workings of the cup holder stuff. So now you have the cup holder out so you can use it to put a drink, but the dashboard still looks as good as it did before. And when you don't want the cup holder anymore, it goes right back inside so you don't have to look at those cup holders. It's actually a pretty ingenious idea, pretty smart engineering, even though it may seem like, well, sort of over-engineering. Now, the other item worth noting over here, you can open up the glove box and you will notice these little strips on the top, these panels, those are CD slots. You would press the button on the side and then it would sort of fall forward and out and you could store CDs there. It wasn't a CD changer, it was just for CD storage. So when you wanted to listen to your favorite CD, it was right there in the glove box in your storage compartment. Now, as for the back seats in this car, just like other 997 models, it has back seats and they're very small. With very upright backrests, it would be tremendously uncomfortable and cramped to sit in these back seats, but they're there, two of them with full seat belts in case you do use them. More likely though, you'll want the space for storage, and here's a cool feature. You can fold down the backrest. The back of the backrest is carpeted, and then you have a larger storage area back there. Now, this is true in most 911 models, you can fold down the backrest of the rear seats for storage, but it's hard to access in most 911 models because it's behind the front seats, it's hard to get to. But in the Targa, with its hatchback rear glass, it's actually pretty easy to get to. So if you fold down those back seats, you have a surprisingly large amount of storage back there where you can stick stuff if you want to go on a road trip in your 997 Targa, which is a 997 hatchback as well. And of course, there's also more storage space up front. You can see the front trunk here has a pretty decent amount of space all on its own, which adds to the practicality of this car. This was undoubtedly the most practical variant of the 997 911. All right, driving the 997 Targa 4S. It always feels so good to be in a 997 911 because these cars are just so perfectly set up. The clutch, the shifter, the steering, the feel, the sound, the size, they're just wonderful. And I love a new 911 and I love a 991, but the 997, to me, the 997 kind of feels like the last of the old school feeling 911s. Now, people said that about the 993, and then they said that about the 996, and now here I am saying about the 997. But once, you know, they got bigger, they got more luxury, they got more PDK, they got more expensive, you lost some of the appeal, some of the tossable littleness, and some of the mechanical feel of the earlier cars. And this one feels so mechanical, and man, this transmission is just so good. The clutch and the shifter are just perfect, absolutely perfect, especially the shifter. It just slots into gear perfectly. Oh, I just love driving a stick 997. They're just wonderful. Now, I say this after I actually spent an hour this morning driving my Carrera GT. I woke up at 5 a.m. before everybody and took it out for a little bit, and that car has a perfect shifter clutch action as well. But this is similar, and that's enormously high praise for a car that costs, you know, 1/20th. This feels like that in terms of just how well engineered and well designed it is from a shifter and clutch standpoint. And that's a pretty cool compliment to the 997. Now, here's an interesting thing. I worked at Porsche when the 997 was on sale as a new car. I had 4 different 997s as company cars. I've driven countless 997s in various situations, including a few for videos. I just did a 997 Turbo video like a year ago. I have never driven a Targa. The Targas are just so immensely, immensely rare that I have never driven one. In fact, you almost never see them. And so when we had the opportunity to shoot this Targa and to run around Cars and Bids, I said, yes, please, especially considering this car's fantastic story. So this is a one-owner car, and the woman who owns it, she spec'd it out as a new car back in 2007, and she's owned it ever since. And she told me she's mostly spent that time in a minivan driving her kids around, but she had this in the garage to have fun with, you know, on the occasional times when she was able to not drive a minivan. And it's so rare to see any form of Targa, let alone, you know, a one-owner, unmodified, nice manual transmission, and it's an S. And so it's just, if you're looking for a Targa, this is the one. Oh, 997s just drive so well. And you know, I've kind of gotten myself into this trap where I think you need a turbo in order to have a good time in a 997. But here I am in an S, and man, is this a good time. This car is fast, it's fun, it's just little enough to toss it around. A dialed in 997, so a nice, relatively low mileage, not modified, not screwed up car is one of the great Porsche experiences you can have, especially considering what they sell for. Whether you get a base Carrera or anything all the way up to a turbo, it's just one of the great Porsche experiences that you can have. It really is. 997s are just wonderfully, wonderfully dialed in. And every time I drive one, I'm reminded of that. This car is just so good to use, so wonderfully engineered. And like I said, new 911s are the same, but there was just something about this era where 911s felt more mechanical. They felt more accessible to drive fast. Man, the steering is just perfect. It always is and always has been. It's not quite as precise as in a modern sports car, brand new one, but it's better than you might expect, and the handling is just fantastic. The car feels so stable and so flat. It corners so flat, very predictable, very little body roll, despite the fact that the ride doesn't beat you up, which is, of course, another great Porsche benefit, the ability to kind of do it all, to have you know, a dailyable car and still have one of the great sports cars of all time. It's just a trait of all the 911s. They do it so well. And this one is just a fantastic reminder of that. A wonderful car and a great reminder of how great a good 997 really is. And so that's the 997 Porsche 911 Targa 4S. Like I said, many enthusiasts don't even know that this body style exists, but it does, and you can buy this fantastic one on Cars and Bids. And now it's time to give this Targa a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 61 out of 100, which places the 997 Targa 4S here against some similar cars. There's a lot to love about this Targa 4S, as it has all the great qualities of a regular 997 Carrera S, like excellent acceleration, fantastic handling, and a great shifter and clutch action, plus the novelty of the unusual Targa roof. The added practicality of a hatchback and all-wheel drive helps too, making this a surprisingly well-rounded Porsche.